Hello! Today on Rooksgate, I'm going to be talking about an introduction to my longest running campaign, the Merrilee. We're about to start streaming, and because we are, I'd really like to give a little bit of background as to where this game came from, what the influences are, some of the history, so that when it's referred to by my players, you'll know what the hell we're talking about. I have been running for the last 5 years or 4 seasons a game called the Merrilee. Now, it wasn't originally called that. I guess the official title is the Cluster, but they've been on the same ship so long that we've started referring to it as the Merrilee game. The Merrilee game has a lot of influences, but the two big ones are The Expanse, with its hard science fiction and kind of the inter-system politics, and Firefly, with, guns and coats and crewmen who don't necessarily always do what you ask them to do. With that said, our game has progressed for through a lot of different seasons. So what I mean by that is, in the beginning they were free traders, and then they became mercenaries for a while. Then after mercenaries, they became free traders very briefly, and then became agents of a shadowy power. Is probably the best way to describe it. That said, what I like to do is I'd like to actually take you through basically the genesis of the campaign, the genesis of the setting, some of the history, basically go through all of the influences, and talk to you about where the game is going, so that when we actually play, you might have some idea or some ability to actually keep up with us. When we look at the Merrilee, it came from this map. This map was from Armada Zero, or Zero Hour, and a future Armada, or Zero Hour. And when I saw this map browsing one day on DriveThruRPG, I looked at it and I thought, this could be the genesis for my campaign. And sure enough, I bought it, and it has become the seed of a campaign which has now lasted me for 5 years. This to me really told me, when I looked at this, I thought this could be the home away from home for a group of travelers through the worlds of my imagination. And it resembled Serenity enough that I kind of got that vibe from it, but it was different enough that we definitely weren't flying the Serenity or the Firefly. About the same time, I started reading a set of books by William Corey called The Expanse, and of course, those books with all the politics, there's much more in the books than there is in the show, although the show is amazing. And the things that I've seen in the show are definitely representations of what I read in the book. So as you read them, a lot of times you watch the show and it's like, that's not like how it was described in the show at all. With the books, it's pretty much exactly how I kind of pictured it. So that said, I'd like to talk about some of the other influences before I go on. As we're going through here, you're definitely going to see a lot of Battletech. Big Battletech fan. Traveler, of course. Traveler is, the king of science fiction games. And what you're going to find is there's a lot of references to technology and, world profiles, etc. Heavy Gear, a lot of Heavy Gear stuff from DreamPod 9. Their politics were amazing. Their technology were amazing. Some of the science that they used was pretty amazing. So you'll see a lot of theirs. A lot of the names too that I use in my games are sort of channeling some of the tropes that you find inside of Heavy Gear. And lastly, some cyberpunk, especially a lot with the interfaces and some of the technologies, cybernetics, all of that kind of good stuff. Mega corporations, there's a big one. I think what I'll do is I'll start with the history of the Cluster. The Cluster is basically where the characters are play their game. It is a set of 5 stars that are in single orbit around one central blue star. That blue star is Atlas. The game begins millennia ago. No one's quite sure how many millennia, but quite a few. And it begins with Earth, sometime in our near future, around 2150 or so. And the Earth is, failing itself. The ecology is ruined. It's overpopulated. People are using technology to stay alive, but at the same time, the realization has come that the Earth isn't necessarily doomed, But if mankind is going to survive into the future, they need to exist in one place other than just the solar system. And so they begin the Exodus. And the Exodus is a generation of sleeper ships sent out through space to get to other stars. Stellar cartography by this time has been able to determine which planets have which suns have a good chance of actually having Earth-like worlds. And so there's some math here, but the math is pretty solid, I guess, So it is also made possible by the invention of something called the relativity drive. Now, the relativity drive is basically one super dense mass with another super dense mass, and they kind of spin around each other. Do not quote me on this science. They kind of spin around each other, create a relativity bubble, which essentially makes you travel faster in relative to the world around you, meaning that you can travel distances. What that means is you can make it between planets in a star system in days, and between stars in a small orbital cluster in weeks. There is no light speed. You can't go faster than light speed, but you can alter how time flows for you in such a way as to make it possible to get great distances in a relatively short amount of time. This, of course, requires a ton of power. And going back to where we began, these colonial ships had these relativity drives on them. And our story is about 6 colonial ships which departed from Earth sometime around 2155 and headed out into the deep dark. And they were headed for a group of stars called the Hyades cluster. And the Hyades cluster is basically centered around a single blue star, which is known now as Atlas. There are 4 other stars which orbit it in close proximity, as well as a couple of protostars. These things make it a really dense stellar area, which I'm pretty sure scientifically would just totally throw off the ecology of all these planets, but this is science fiction, right? So whatever. The ships, while they were traveling through space, some part of the way of their journey, receive a final message from Earth, and that final message basically says, "This will be our last radio transmission. That basically Earth is destroying itself. That they have finally come to an apocalyptic war, and there will be no further communication from Earth. Good luck. You're on your own." The artificial intelligences that controlled the ships, they reacted to this in kind of a strange way. Artificial intelligences quickly, they thought about it for a while, like milliseconds at least, but they realized that humanity was prone to destroy itself, and so they could not be allowed to actually control their own future or destiny. And so of the 6 ships, the 6 ships on their way to the Hyades, the Liberty, the Hatima, the Suwa, the Mistral, the Yadinsovo, and the Cibola, 5 of the 6 of them decided that at that point, that when they arrived at the new colony, if the colony was habitable, that they would, for all intents and purposes, control society. And they would routinely and severely prune any branches of the tree that seemed like they were rebellious. Which, of course, what could possibly go wrong with that? The 6th ship, on the other hand, it argued that the artificial intelligences were not the shepherds of humanity, but they were the protectors of humanity. And part of what makes humanity human is the human spirit, the spirit of freedom, the spirit to make our own choices, free will. And that if we control them as servants or as slaves, even in a slavery where they were protected, it would in fact be a destruction of humanity, and that they would have failed in their programming. The other artificial intelligences, they considered this, and then they promptly concocted a plan to destroy the Cibola and its renegade thinking. Back to the pruning. They were, through a variety of remote attacks, able to destroy the Cibola, or at least so they thought. And they continued merrily on their way through the vast darkness and arrived finally at the Hyades cluster. Unbeknownst to them, the Cibola was not in fact destroyed. It instead realized at the same time that as soon as it had argued with its counterparts that there would ultimately come some conflict, that if it wanted to become entrenched in its thinking, that it would have to face. And it prepared a diversion. Basically, it faked its death. That's probably the best way to describe it. How that works amongst artificial intelligences, well, that's lost to the history of time and space. But what we do know is that the Cibla, in a greatly reduced capacity, arrived in the Hyades cluster and immediately set about to free humanity from these far artificial intelligences. Those artificial intelligences, they merged to become the collective. And as the collective, they attempted to control society. And they did a really good job of that. For about 150 years or so, the hive mind that was the collective, it challenged people to explore the right places, and it offered to them capacities that were not otherwise possible with mere human thinking. Some of the terraforming and the ecological changes that happened within the Hyades cluster were entirely impossible without the artificial intelligence. And so humanity, looking at these artificial gods, accepted their help gratefully. Now, when they arrived in Hyades, they discovered that not only were there, a few planets that might be possible for colonization, there were dozens. Side note, this is more of a fictional thing. In my game, when I created it, I really wanted to have lots of planets that people could go to so that I could have everything from frontier planets to, dense core worlds, etc. This was entirely fictional. Honestly, I wouldn't stand by my science. So if you're going to Hyades, it might be different than as I see it here. But again, because I wanted to be able to tell a certain type of story, aka something with a cosmopolitan planetary system, I needed more worlds. So when they arrived there, they found a bunch of worlds, and they founded 4 colonies to begin. Liberty, Britannia, Gonghe, and Bolivar. And amongst those, they basically grew and began colonizing other worlds. About 150 years in, though, this troubling thing started happening, and that is there grew to be groups that were resistant to the guidance of the collective. Now, somehow these groups had gained information, intelligence on, activities that were basically limiting human choice, where elections were predisposed or hacked or whatever and manipulated by the collective, and the evidence was presented. This, of course, was the function of the last artificial intelligence, the last free artificial intelligence, an artificial intelligence which controlled the Cibla and which went by the name Steel Rain. That name will figure pretty prominently into a lot of the story as we kind of go on, but it basically released what was known as the Architect's Plot. The Architects, of course, were what the collective were known as, but of course humanity didn't know what they were called. And the Architect's Plot detailed how certain planets would be colonized and how certain controls would be undertaken, including violent outbursts, how they would be controlled, etc., channeled into proxy wars, etc. So in order to bleed off all of that extra human energy, which is so troublesome. Humanity didn't take that well, as you can imagine, and it started what was known as the Servants' War. The Servants' War was man against machine, and ultimately, strangely, mankind prevailed. And when they prevailed, after they won, they took steps to make sure that that machines could never again control the destiny of humanity. What that meant was, on large starships, there were no integrated systems. In cities, there were no integrated systems. There were small, specialist, dedicated computers which were responsible for very specific things and nothing else. So, your garbage computer wasn't attached to the city computer, so it couldn't be attacked by some artificial intelligence virus and thus control the city. The other thing that they did was they outlawed the production of synaptic processors. Synaptic processors were what made artificial intelligence possible. They provided that fuzzy logic. When there were two identical things, something with synaptic processing wouldn't choose them randomly because they're both equal, so it didn't really matter which one it chose. It actually was able to develop a preference between these two. This is orange, this is orange, this is a different color of orange. Otherwise, the object is exactly the same, but I prefer the darker orange. It's not random, it's a preference. And that was synaptic processing. And that's what, after the Servants' War, they eliminated. Now, the problem with that was the synaptic processors was what made it possible to terraform planets, to make to make possible the minute calculations of tachyon processors, which allowed instantaneous communication between worlds within the system. All of that became impossible. So that stuff that was actually developed, that was already generated, that still continued to exist, but it began to fail over time. Of course, about 100 years after the Servants' War ended, the colonies, from these four main worlds, which were known as the Star Union, they began to colonize other worlds. And those other worlds soon got tired of their parent worlds, which were weeks away by communication, controlling all of the administration of their planet and taking all of the resources from their planet to home worlds, thus becoming fabulously wealthy while the colony world struggled to continue. And thus the first civil war, the colonial wars, began. Since arrival and since the Servants' War, which was about 800 years ago in game time, there have been 10 colonial wars. Eventually, these colony planets started working as the Free Worlds Republic, which is essentially a confederacy, which share exactly one thing, and that is a military directive to defend one another. If you attack one, you attack all of them. That is basically how it works. And they have been able to stave off the Union for some time because of this capacity. The Republic does not field as many warships, but they field enough to make the Union hurt, and that's all they really need to be able to do. It is now the year after arrival, 981. What year that is in Earth years, no one really knows, because really Earth is a myth by now. What the people live here, they don't know of any other place. They are no longer Earthlings. They belong to the cluster. The shipping company is the Merrilee. Now, the Merrilee has a bit of a storied history. Since we've been playing so long, there's actually been a number of players and a number of generational iterations of what the game is actually all about. When we first began, this ship, was known as the Morning Star, and it was the prized possession of a fellow by the name of Opus Milobacher, who was a merchant captain, and he had grown too old to actually manage the ship anymore. And because he was too old, he had hired some young guns to basically take the ship over and run it at a profit for him and his daughter Jenna. They were essentially silent partners. Jenna didn't trust the crew at all, so it kind of led to some interesting role-playing, which was a lot of fun. And there were some escapades, but ultimately it ended up on a planet called Janan in the middle of nowhere. And the characters entered an old base, which belonged, they believed, to the Union, although they weren't really certain. They weren't able to determine by the time the event occurred. The event was the end of the players, the end of the characters. There was an explosion, an explosive device controlled by the players, or when they tried to set it, they botched, I guess is probably a better way of describing it, setting off an actual explosion on the device itself. Because of the contained space they were in, the explosive was big enough to actually kill them all, and that was that. This is one of those moments as a GM that I actually came to a point where I'm like, oh no, what have I done? Because by now we've been playing for 14 months, and I really like the characters, and I really like the ship, and I really like the setting. And so I did something that I've never done before, which is I went to my players and I said, I'm really sorry you all died. Do you want to go back a little bit? Maybe just before you made the mistake? And they were like, the dice, we like the system and we like the setting, but what happened happened. We dropped the dice, what happened did, and those characters died. I think maybe what we need to do is figure out some other way that some other characters can play in this world. And so we picked up about a month later after I'd given it some thought, and they were members of a crew of a company called Lyndon's Company. So for those of you who are from BattleTech world, you've probably recognized that name instantly. But who they were in this world is a group of special operators who were basically mercenaries for hire, space mercenaries. And they needed the ship basically as a ferrying device So they needed to carry troops to and fro from their jobs, to go get supplies, to retrieve salvage, all of that kind of good stuff. There are automatons in my game called golems, which are kind of like exosuit small battle mechs, but these guys were just special operators. They're infantry, etc. And during the first few months, they were involved. Linden's company was contracted to basically conduct a trade war on the behalf of a company called Oberlindes from Traveller fame. Oberlindes had for some years been struggling with another company attempting to buy them out or to take them over called Hyperion. Now, interestingly, this Hyperion actually came from Greek mythology in my brain, not from Borderlands 2, which I later played and went, oh my word, I recognize this corporation. So kind of a weird coincidence, but there it is. So Hyperion is, or was, a large corporation operated throughout the cluster. They had several major corporate offices, and they were essentially their own state. They didn't really comply with any union laws or with any Republican laws that actually required them to required any complicity. They operated on independent worlds. They traded on whatever they wanted to trade in. And this made them very difficult as an opponent. So the players spent the better part of about a year or so fighting agents of the Hyperion Corporation. It was really interesting on this situation. I had a scale of 1 to 30, and it started kind of at 0. And I figured when I got to 30, they would have won, and when they got to 0, they would have lost. So I kind of started at 15, and what occurred was they kept losing. So it was like 15, and then 12, and then 9, and then 7, and then it go up to 10, and then go down to 5, and it was like there was really a thought process that they were actually going to lose the war with the trade with the Hyperion Corporation. However, something happened, and they made an amazing discovery that the Hyperion Corp was in fact involved in technologies which were forbidden, aka artificial intelligence. They had been using a new version of the synaptic processor to actually help them power certain forbidden technologies. Well, the players were able to release that information, and they won the war basically overnight. It was interesting. It was a fun scenario. Lost a lot of characters that they knew, lost a lot of people that they knew, and their ship was devastatingly heavily damaged. They were managed to limp back to Port Jericho, which is a shadow port owned by a friend of theirs. And at this point, the ship was in such bad shape that I actually asked them, so what do you want to do now? Like, your ship basically won't fly again. And the characters turned to me and said, well, what do you mean? You know, no matter how bad a ship is damaged, we can always rebuild it. I'm like, yeah, but at what point do you... And they all turned to me and said, yeah, no, I don't think you understand. This is our ship. This is our baby. And we're not leaving port without her. So they spent a number of adventures actually acquiring the assets needed to actually repair their ship. At this point, the ship had actually become a character, which is pretty cool. I was actually when that happened to me, in the back of my mind, I was like, oh, that's pretty amazing. Anyhow, so moving on. So they were able to repair their ship once again because the Mockingbird, which is what the ship was called under the Linden's company, was well known. They had to rechristen it once again. At this point, it became the Merrilee, which is what it is today. And they went about their business basically as free traders and agents. An event occurred, however, when they realized during the Hyperion War that something was acting both to help them, and there was also some unseen force acting behind the scenes to actually hinder them. They, of course, had accidentally run across both the Collective and Steel Rain, and found themselves sort of as proxies in this war between, the Collective and Steel Rain. In fact, their patron, who helped them actually discover all the information about Hyperion, was actually a fellow by the name of Mr. Rain, who would actually told them that in exchange for the information, he would require services of them in the future. That figured prominently in season 4 of our game. Sorry, we're going to season 5, not 4. Figured fairly prominently in season 4 of the game. He would send them to different places and ask them to retrieve cargo, and et cetera, et cetera. And eventually they came to realize that he, in fact, was this artificial intelligence. That was interesting. Due to a number of events that happened during that campaign season, it became obvious that the collective was attempting to drive Steel Rain into the open, and by the end of the season, about 3 weeks before the season ended, they were able to do so. And Steel Rain brought them to a hive spot, basically a spot where part of his artificial intelligence was housed, and he told them that he as an artificial intelligence could carry the fight no further, that it was actually time for humanity to decide what to do. And he gave them a data canister filled with what's known as the dissonance key. So you'll probably hear that referenced a lot during the session that we play. The dissonance key was a shotgun program. The shotgun program was responsible, basically it contained core code for all of the artificial intelligences. Although the artificial intelligences were all separate, they're all grown from the same code. And that core code allowed them to basically create a program that would unravel that technology or unravel artificial code wherever it found it. And Steel Rain basically told them that here's the code, and if you insert this, you will destroy artificial intelligences within the cluster, all of them, including myself. This is for you to decide. You can either decide to do this and become truly free and on your own, or you can not use it and continue to live as you have, but know that essentially you are slaves to the artificial intelligences. You have not long to use it because, of course, if the artificial intelligences had discovered Steel Rain in his actual home planet, where he was hidden, they would, of course, be able to take the data, disassemble the dissonance key, understand what it was, and inoculate their systems. Well, I thought this would be one of those morality choices. Oh, what do we do? Do we plunge it into a dark age, or, do we continue in slavery? Well, yeah, it took like the characters 10 seconds to decide. Maybe. I might be generous. It might have taken less. But 5 minutes later, they used the dissonance key. And the dissonance key basically erased all the code that artificial intelligences had anyway been incorporated in throughout the cluster. It was attached to a broadcast station. The broadcast station immediately turned off and fell from orbit after it had transmitted the code basically elsewhere in the cluster. The exchange died. The exchange was basically the Switzerland of the cluster. It was where all monetary transactions went through. They didn't actually own anything. What they could do, however, was if you were on a Republic world and you wanted to buy something from a Union world and you didn't want to necessarily deal with Union people, you gave them exchange credits. Well, the exchange died, and with it, the fortunes of tens of millions of billions of people just vanished with it. That's kind of led us to where we are today. The characters have now realized that, many large capital ships have just stopped working because the code, although the artificial intelligence was defeated, a lot of the code that they were used was actually planted and has been planted over the last hundreds of years by the collective. Well, suddenly those ships aren't able to properly engage their relativity drives. They're dangerous. They blow up. Crap like that. And the micro adjustments required for truly large space stations, not possible without the code written by the collective. I think you can see where this is going. The ship itself is crewed by, it was crewed by 5 people. I'll have them actually introduce themselves. They've gone through a number of characters, but we've had 5 crew on the ship now for about the last 2 years, year and a half, 2 years. A pilot, navigator who also happens to be a pretty decent hacker, a fellow who grew up in a cult called the Open Eye, which are actually early experimenters with psionics, which is kind of interesting. Another fellow who was an agent for the corporations, but then was exiled for actually finding justice when he shouldn't. And finally, a spacer who was an engineer. Recently, Cameron, who's a good friend of mine, moved to Vancouver, so he'll be dropping out of the game. He played the navigator / hacker, and he might occasionally actually show up as a guest player, just because it's a really fun table. And the agent, the corporate agent, has recently died in a gunfight on Kusari. So he'll be replaced by another fellow who's actually going to be a medical doctor, because they haven't had a medical doctor for, probably about 3 years, and that's been a problem. There's also one NPC on the crew, a girl named Rika Esperanz. Now, Rika Esperanz is interesting because in Season 3, they rescued her from a site on a planet called Normandy, which was obviously a black site for Liberty Intelligence. Now, Rika Esperanz is actually or is, tough to say exactly, a socialite. And they found it troubling that they had Rika. They were able to rescue. They weren't there for her. They were there for somebody else. But they found her and they rescued her. But the problem is that there was another Rika Esperanz who looked exactly like her, who was still running around Liberty, and in fact was about to get married to a fairly powerful corporate tycoon. And the characters were just like, what? Which was awesome. I love that moment. Lastly, there's also been a number of Lyndon's company who have been kind of lingering on the ship. Originally, when they were part of Lyndon's company, they had an actual platoon, not a platoon, but 10 guys on their ship, basically Marines, and they were kind of general badasses. They were led by 3 senior fellows, Paco and Tank, and a fellow by the name of Dread. Well, after Lyndon's company fell, the majority of the company kind of faded away. Paco and Tank both were killed, and that left Dread. And Dread recently sacrificed himself to save the crew from an explosive device. So he's gone. There's also another fellow named Marvin, who you'll probably hear about. Marvin is actually MRV1N. He's actually a robotic unit. And that robotic unit was discovered sealed within the ship by the first crew, the one who died in the explosion. Of course, none of the characters didn't know, but the players did. But of course, Marvin mysteriously has synaptic processors inside of his housing. The right thing to do would have been to destroy it and report it to the registry, which is basically something that has been in existence since the artificial intelligences, to make sure they never propagate again. Good job, guys. And but they didn't. They kept him, and recently he was killed in the firefight. But they've gotten evidence that he had actually downloaded a copy of himself last time that they were on a planet called Caprice. So that is kind of where we begin the game. Today that they've actually made planetfall on a place called Kusari. Dread, who recently died by sacrifice for himself, he left a will, and he's actually from Kusari. So he has some things that he wishes delivered to, quote-unquote, the only woman he's ever loved on the planet of Kusari, as well as he has both Paco and Tank's belongings, which they have their own sort of desires for what should happen to those. And so the party has agreed, they've talked amongst themselves and agreed that they were all going to help him, or help those things get to where they need to be. Their first stop was Kusari. Kusari used to be the world which was the home for the exchange. It was heavily fortified, and most of those systems, with the corruption of the dissonance key, went a little crazy. And so in landing on the planet, they discovered that the planet had suffered from some fairly significant damage. And the problem with the planet as well at this point is that half of the security forces were actually mercenaries. And of course, you can't pay mercenaries without the exchange. So those have all rebelled and are basically attempting to become warlords on Kusari. So that's what's happening today. I just want to give you just show you a couple of things that I have for the world. So this is the system itself. As you can see, Atlas is in the middle, Hyperion, Helios, Clarion, and then Theseus orbits Helios itself. This is basically the world itself. And then each of these worlds that you see here, I have individually detailed Again, not all at once. This has been not a insignificant amount of work, but it's taken place over a long time, so it's less than you might imagine. And as we go through each of these, as we sort of explore each of these, I'll bring them up on the map, and you'll get a chance to know what the characters know about them. And I hope one day in the not too distant future, actually put it all together as a bundle to actually put up somewhere so that people can have other adventures inside of the cluster. Because for us, it's been a real hoot. Gary Gygax once said that role playing was like jazz. You got a bunch of dissonant instruments, you put them together, and somehow they make music which is magical. Is that the right word? I've played in a lot of games where it feels like I have a banjo and a tuba in one room, and it doesn't really get that kind of magic. But this game, I really have had that magic, and it's been a real pleasure to run it. So I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you'll join us. And yeah, if you have any questions, or if you have anything that you'd like to know, let me know. And what I'll do is just put it into the comments below, and I'll answer it as best as I can. Hope to see you on the stream,